Hey everyone, it's Joanne Molinaro. Welcome back to my kitchen, the Korean vegan kitchen. Today, I'm going to show you how to make a very super easy, but still delicious and nutritious recipe using one of my all-time favorite ingredients, and of course, that is tofu. But before we get into making the recipe, I wanted to take a little bit of time to answer a few questions that you or a lot of people may have about tofu. So what is tofu? Well, it's actually soybean curd. So here's where I want to tell you a funny story. Back when Anthony and I first started dating, I asked him, do you like tofu? And he was like, no, I never want to eat tofu ever in the whole world. I was like, why? It's so great. Now keep in mind, at that time, I'd been eating tofu my whole life, so I didn't think that there was this weird reaction for tofu. He once asked me, what even is tofu? And I told him it's bean curd. And he told me, well, that's probably why I never want to eat it. Who would want to eat something called bean curd? Now, before you start to gross out about bean curd, can you think about a different food that you've probably eaten that also constitutes a type of curd? Cheese is milk curd, or more specifically, whey curd. And I can tell you right now, my Italian-American husband had no problem eating milk curd. Now, like cheese, tofu is made by curdling the milk that's produced from soybeans. And again, like cheese, depending on how long it's cured, how much liquid it retains, what flavorings might be added, you're gonna get a total variety of textures and even flavors of tofu. Again, like cheese, some tofus might be really firm and sort of crumbly, and other tofus might be sort of jiggly and even soft, a little bit like custard or yogurt. But unlike cheese, tofu is a complete protein composed of all 9 of the essential amino acids. Therefore, instead of using tofu as a garnish or a side ingredient or as a condiment, it's often thought of and used as sort of a main entree ingredient like chicken or pork. Instead of being the source of flavor, tofu is really good at absorbing flavors. In fact, molecularly speaking, think of tofu as sort of a sponge, and the firmer your tofu is, the spongier it gets. But isn't soy bad for you? The truth is, there's been a ton of misinformation on what soy does to the human body. As a result, a lot of people have been misled into thinking that tofu is somehow bad for you, that it causes cancer or causes man boobs or makes men more feminized. Now, part of the reason for this confusion is in the name. Tofu actually contains a compound called phytoestrogen. Not exactly the same thing as estrogen, but it sounds really similar. As a result, many people have been confused into believing, oh no, tofu has too much estrogen in it. It's gonna give me man boobs, it's gonna make me more feminized, or it's gonna put me at risk for breast cancer. Now, luckily, there's been a ton of science, especially recently, that proves just the opposite. Instead of being a food that you need to be afraid of, tofu and many soy products are actually really good for you. In fact, the science has proven that phytoestrogens actually block the excess of estrogen in people's bodies, thus reducing a woman's risk for breast cancer and reducing people's risk for heart disease. Now, what about the macros? Well, once again, tofu is pretty hard to beat. As we talked about before, it's a complete protein. It contains all 9 of the essential amino acids. And for 200 calories worth of tofu, you're gonna get roughly the same amount of protein as you would 200 calories of chicken breast. But like all plant foods, tofu doesn't have any cholesterol, and it has far less saturated fats while having far more of the good fats. Plus, tofu has one of my favorite micronutrients, fiber. You're not gonna find any fiber in your chicken breast. Now, I could go on for another 10-minute video on all of the different health benefits and the misinformation about soy and tofu, but I'll keep it at this. Remember, I've been eating tofu my entire life. I'm 42 years old and I've been eating it my entire life. And moreover, tofu for many hundreds of millions of people hasn't been viewed as a meat alternative. It's not something that came onto the scene because of veganism. It's been around for over 1,000 years. So, unless you're allergic to soy, from a health-based perspective, there's really no reason to be avoiding it. Now, as we discussed, tofu comes in a variety of different textures. If you go to a Western grocery store, you're gonna find probably an extra firm tofu like this, and maybe even a firm tofu. But if you go to an Asian grocery store, you are going to see so many more different kinds and textures of tofu. For example, you might find a soft tofu, or you might find them in tubes like these, which is silken tofu. Remember, the firmer the tofu, the less water it has retained. And in many cases, the better it's going to be at absorbing those flavors. But what does it taste like? I would say if you're going for an extra firm tofu, or in this case, a super firm tofu, it's gonna taste a lot like chicken breast. But if you're going for a softer variety, like the silken tofu that comes in tubes, or even the soft tofu that comes in these little containers here, it's gonna be more like a custard or a yogurt. It's gonna be jiggly, and it's going to really melt and dissolve as soon as it gets into your mouth. All right, since I've now given you the entire download on tofus, I'm gonna show you how to make a very, very simple recipe that you can probably put together in just a few minutes. It's excellent, it's delicious, it's incredibly nutritious, as we've just talked about, and I think it's gonna be one of your go-tos soon. So for the recipe, we're actually gonna use extra firm tofu. The reason for that is twofold. This is readily accessible. You're gonna be able to find this at virtually every grocery store, unless of course it's a pandemic and everyone starts eating extra firm tofu. But nowadays, you should be able to find this really easily. The second reason I wanna use extra firm tofu for this recipe is because it's the easiest of all of the tofus to cook with. So let's get started. You're gonna find that when you open the package, I just like to use my knife to cut it open, that it's sitting in water. It's sitting in its own brine, if you will. And that's designed to help preserve the texture of the tofu, make sure it doesn't dry out. What I like to do is I just go over to the sink and I dump the liquid if I know I'm gonna use the entire block. However, if I know I'm only gonna use a portion of that, like if you're cooking for one, then I preserve that liquid, put it in some Tupperware along with whatever tofu I didn't end up using, because again, it helps to make sure that tomorrow, a few days from now, your tofu is still nice and not dry, which is what will happen if you get rid of all the liquid. All right, so we dumped out the brine. It's still a little wet here, okay? And now what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna pat it dry with a kitchen towel. The reason for this is if we want a really good sear on our tofu, you wanna make sure that it's pretty dry. Any water that's still on the top of the tofu surface is gonna make it really hard for that tofu to get nice and brown, which is what we're trying to go for here. So what we're gonna do is we're going to cut these up into smaller pieces. All right, so we've got about 1/3 of an inch thick slices. If you want to make them smaller, you can certainly cut it in half lengthwise like that in order to get 16 pieces. But I like to keep them long like this. So I've got here a non-stick pan, all right? I think that it's best, especially if you're a beginner, to try and use a non-stick pan as opposed to, say, a steel pan. But a cast iron will also work very well for this. And I'm gonna turn my stove top on to about medium high. What we're gonna do is we're gonna add about a tablespoon of your favorite cooking oil. You can use extra virgin olive oil for this. You can also use canola oil. You can use avocado oil, regular vegetable oil. So we're gonna put about a tablespoon, and that's all you need. Now here's the part that a lot of people mess up when they're first time cooking tofu, is they think, all right, I put the oil in, now I add the tofu. No, you wanna wait for at least a minute for your oil to get really nice and hot. If you add the tofu now, while the oil is still just getting kind of warm, all that's gonna happen is that your tofu, remember it's a sponge, it's gonna wanna suck up all that oil, and instead of getting nice and crisp, it's gonna stay soggy and kind of not fun. All right, it's been about a minute, so let's go ahead and add our tofu. You hear that sound? That's what you want to hear when you add your tofu. If you don't hear that sound, take it out and wait another 15 seconds. So another mistake that people frequently make when they're cooking tofu is that they put all the tofu in the pan. As you can see, I've tried to spread them around so they're barely touching, and that's a really important part to making sure that you're getting the best sear on your tofu. Don't crowd the pan. So the other mistake that people often make when cooking tofu is they think 1, 2, 3 minutes per side. Nope. Because there is a lot of liquid inside the tofu, you're gonna have to wait probably closer to 5, 6, or even 7 minutes per side before you flip. All right, so I think we're ready to finally flip our tofu. Now, as you saw, there's a golden crust forming at the very bottom of each of our tofu pieces. You need to look for that crust before it's time to flip. So you're gonna wanna cook on this second side for a little bit less time than you had to for the first side, probably closer to about 3 to 4 minutes. But again, you wanna look for that golden crust at that bottom. All right, I think we're just about done here. So this is what our tofu looks like right off the stove, and it smells so good. I can't wait to eat it. I'm gonna actually grab a little bit of sauce from my fridge. It's a sauce that I make all the time and always have on hand. If you want the recipe for the sauce, you're gonna have to tune in next week. I'll show you how to make it. So I'm just gonna take a couple spoonfuls here and I'm gonna drizzle it over the top. Now, a lot of you tofu experts might be wondering, well, Joanne, why don't you marinate the tofu in this sauce before you seared it? Marinating tofu can be a little bit complicated. We know that it's a wonderful sponge and it absorbs all those flavors so very well, but when you fry tofu that's already been marinated, sometimes you end up burning the ingredients in the sauce, and then you don't get quite the lovely sear that you wanted. I find that this method of preparation is just cleaner, it's easier, and it's still just as flavorful. That is so delicious. You really get the flavor of the sauce. It's like super umami packed, but then you get this lovely kind of texture with the tofu, and it's dual textured, right? Because it's sort of crispy on the outside, but soft on the inside. I would eat this with a bowl of rice, maybe a little bit of vegetables or kimchi, of course. Call it a day. Such a great meal, super easy to make. All right, everyone, that's it for day one of tofu preparation. You've probably learned way more about tofu than you ever really wanted to, but I hope you found it informative and even enjoyable. But mostly, I hope you try this method of preparing tofu the next time you're in your grocery store and you're like, bean curd, I know what that is. That's not too weird for me. Try this recipe. I think you'll really enjoy it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button below if you haven't already. If you could leave a comment or two, that would be amazing. But mostly, make sure to tune in next week when I show you how to make this amazing sauce, as well as another wonderful, incredibly easy but still delicious preparation of your favorite new ingredient, tofu. See you later.